A good day, grade 11s. We are going to make a preparation for paper 2, English home language. We're going to try and look at some of the poems that are common and commonly done. And we're going to look at contextual questions, essay questions, unseen poetry in the novel section, which is Tsotsi. Okay, we are going to get to the poetry section and talk about Midterm Break, which is by Simas Hini. Right. When it comes to this type of poem, we're going to do a little discussion first before we can get into answering of the questions and see how we can make people understand the poem. This is a poem about Simas Hini's loss when he was a child, and it's a poem that brings his childhood memories alive. And as such, this is an elegy. The type of poem is an elegy. And when we coming in and saying it's an elegy, we are talking about the issue that we are saying it's based on death. So when we say it's an elegy, we are saying it's based on death to commemorate a dead person. So his younger brother, Christopher, was killed by a car accident at the age of 4 years older. He says, I sat in the morning, all morning in the college sick bay, counting bells, nailing classes to a close. At 2 o'clock, our neighbors drove me home. In the porch, I met my father crying. He had always taken funerals in his stride, and Big Jim Evans saying it was a hard blow. The baby cooed and laughed and rocked the pram when I came in, and I was embarrassed by old men standing up to shake my hand and tell me they were sorry for my trouble. Whispers informed strangers I was the eldest, away at school, as my mother held my hand in hers and coughed out angry, tearless sighs. At 10 o'clock, the ambulance arrived with the corpse stanched and bandaged by the nurses. Next morning, I went up into the room. Snowdrops and candles soothed the bedside. I saw him for the first time in 6 weeks, paler now. And then it says, wearing a poppy bruise on his left temple, he lay in the 4-foot box, as in his cot. No got his scars, the bumper knocked him clear. A 4-foot box, a foot for every year. When we come into the poem, we are given the title Midterm Break. The title creates an irony. We say the title is ironic because the poem is giving connotations of a break, connotations of a routine, a break from a routine. But in this poem, we are not referring to a break. We are referring to a death of the young one, a tragic death of a 4-year-old, which is his brother. He is at boarding school, and therefore we would assume that the poem is going to talk about him going away home during the mid of the term and for a relaxed weekend or short time, but instead he is taken away from school to attend the funeral of his brother. So now when we're coming into the poem, we now realize that it is a reflective poem about the death of the younger brother. So emotions are a roller coaster in this poem because the little boy who has passed away is a brother to him. And as we come into the poem, I believe we are talking about the poem showing a somberness of the death. And I believe when he says he sits in the college sick bay with nothing to do but count the bells, we are going to talk about also the time frame. He sat in the college sick bay the whole day, waiting for whoever was supposed to collect him. And I believe when we're coming in, classes normally have a joyful ending. Ringing of the bell will notify that the lesson has come to an end. But in this poem, he says nailing classes to a close. So instead of saying ringing, it gives us a hint of the mood. So now, instead of him giving the classes a joyful ending, he is bringing in a somberness. So it's a funeral bell in this instance. The ringing of the bell is of the funeral, and that's the one that will ring and announce the sound of the death. So now this gives a clue to us that there is death in the family. He gets picked up by neighbors, not his own family, from school. And therefore, that was the confirmation that something is wrong, as his father or mother did not come and collect him from school. And I believe when you say I sat, we begin the poem with personal pronouns. He says, I sat in all morning. And the personal pronouns shows us the isolation and the personal narration that is coming from him. So he is fine. Instead of him being in the sick bay for being sick, he is there to be in a waiting process to be picked up because something serious has happened. Time passes, and as a result, this is where we pick up the gloomy and dark atmosphere in the poem to realize that something is wrong. Knelling is onomatopoeia, as it is the sound of a funeral bell in line 2. And I believe when we come to the alliteration in line 3, I believe, of the C sound classes, or in the second line of the C sound, counting bells, nailing classes to a close. I believe this is a contribution to the mournful tone that we are experiencing coming to an end. So when we get to the poem, he says he remembers that it was 2:00. Counting bells, nailing classes to a close. At 2:00, our neighbor drove me home. So that's when he realizes that he has been waiting the whole day, and he remembers the time when it happened. And therefore, that is the symbolism and indication of the traumatic event that is about to pounce on him. When we come to the second stanza, in the porch I made my father crying, we are given the image of brokenness in the family. So father figure is now torn down. His father is crying, which indicates that something terrible has happened. The father is on the porch because he does not want to weep in front of the family. So at this time, when he sees the father crying, he says he had always taken funerals in his stride. Strength comes from the father in the family, and therefore he has always assumed the father is a strong character. In other funerals, the father has never cried, but has been the one who carries them through. But now when he comes in, he talks about a big Jim Evans saying it was a hard blow. Community has come together, close-knit community family, a neighbor, a family friend saying it was a terrible tragedy, and therefore he realizes the gathering that is in the home. So when we come in, we are talking about, we're going to discuss the heart blow part because it has a double meaning there. Heart blow, the baby has been hit by a car, but also figuratively, the child's death or passing away has been extremely difficult and hard for the family to get through, and the neighbors as well. So now there is a big contrast between stanza 2 and stanza 3, whereby the father is crying in stanza 2 and the baby is cooing and laughing and rocking the pram in stanza 3. When we say it's a contrast, we're talking about the issue that the father is showing signs of failing to deal with the death. And now we're looking at the baby's behavior in stanza 3, whereby the innocence of the child is shown through the cooing, which is the sound of a dove. And that's a sound that the baby makes when the child is happy and does not understand what has happened. That shows us the age of the child. And as a result, we realize that the adult behavior and the child behavior in stanza 3 has been contrasted there. So now when we're coming to the emotional response that the father shows towards the death of the child, we realize that this death is different from the funerals that the father has attended, because this one is personal. So now we realize that this has become a difficult time and tragedy for the family. When we come to stanza 3, he says, when I came in and was embarrassed by old men standing up to shake my hand, we realize the reverse behavior that usually happens. As a child, he's the one who usually has to greet the elders. But this time around, he is greeted by the elders, and therefore now they take him as an adult. Is grown up. So he's treated as an adult by the neighbors and the people that are in the house. Old men stood up to shake his hand as he enters the room, treating him as a mature male member of the family. And that is where the embarrassment comes in for him, because they take him seriously. He is not used to being taken seriously because he is still young. So as a result, older people are the ones who are usually given the respect and the gesture, but not coming down from the adult to the child. So he is referred to as the eldest, according to stanza 4. And when they say he's the eldest, it makes him now realize that he has some kind of responsibility that and expectations that the adults have for him. The words "sorry for my trouble" and "tell me they were sorry for my trouble," it really shows us one of the things they are failing to mention the death by name, which is now giving it the euphemism that it deserves. And as such, he does not really understand the whole commotion of being treated as an adult. They whisper. He says, whispers inform strangers I was the eldest. That's the sympathy that they are portraying towards him and what he's going through at this moment in time. And then he says, away at school as he was in boarding school. And then now when he comes in, as my mother held my hand in hers and coughed out angry tearless sighs, we now realize the mother is severely grief-stricken and is failing to deal with the death. Despite losing the child, the mother is not blind to the fact that he's still a child, because she still needs to comfort him as the eldest child. So that's where the holding of the hand or symbolizes and means for us in that stanza. So when we come in, we look at the awkwardness that he experiences in stanza 3 and 4 of being taken as an adult, the sympathy that he's making him uncomfortable. So as a result, the hushed atmosphere in the house, and we're also looking at the enjambment that comes in there, as stanza 3 is continued in enjambment in stanza 4, which shows that the mother has been crying continuously and for a while. And I believe when we come in tearless sighs, that is her expression of the deep pain in sighing out. She is so upset. And I believe in this way, we are talking about coughing out the angry, tearless sighs. At 10 o'clock, the ambulance arrived with the corpse stanched and bandaged by the nurses. So now when we say the ambulance arrives, it is bringing the body of the speaker's 4-year-old brother, who was killed by a car. The corpse is said to be stanched and bandaged by the nurses, which has been cleaned to stop the bleeding. And as a result, this is a symbolism of the failed attempts to save the child. So he refers to his brother as a corpse, and this symbolizes the speaker's detachment to accept the situation. I believe this is a state of disbelief and shock on him. He says, next morning I went up into the room. He didn't go the same day he arrived, which was the reason why we're talking about the disbelief and the shock and detachment. But he goes to the room the next morning. And I believe when we come to the next morning, he has not seen the brother for 6 weeks. He says, for the first time, I saw him for the first time in 6 weeks. That is the time frame where he has not been home. He has been at school. So he goes into the room where his brother's body is laid out. And I believe in this stanza, he talks about snowdrops and candles soothing the bedside. Snowdrops are small white flowers, usually seen during the spring, and they symbolize life after death. And now that imagery shows a state of the child being in pain and now being at peace with his brother's passing. So as a result, he no longer refers to his brother as a corpse. Instead, he uses phrases, I saw him, he lay. He goes back to the pronouns now to show his connection and closeness to the brother. And I believe he says, wearing a poppy bruise on his left temple, that is where he was hit by the car. And I believe he says he lay in the 4-foot box as in his cot, nor got his scars, the bumper knocked him clear. So I believe we are talking about the gender of the child, and it is a male child. And I believe when we come in, it's also talking about the pale complexion of the child. He has not got his scars, which means he was not disfigured. There is a description that it gives to show that the child looks at peace and not hurt at all. The dead boy is lying very calm. It means that the speaker compares the small size of the boy when he says he lay in the 4-foot box, and he compares the small size of his brother's coffin with the shortness of his life and the years of his life. And I believe it shows that his life was cut short. And then the last line of the poem, the last stanza of the poem is a one line stanza, which says, a 4-foot box, a foot for every year. Very short, which shows us the age of the brother that passed away. And I believe we are showing the waste of life that has occurred on a very young boy. Let's go to the essay question. We had to give a background of the poem before we went in. It says, Midterm Break is an elegy for the poet's younger brother, wherein the speaker must cope with the grief of others in addition to processing his own sad loss. When it comes to the paper 2 exam, remember question number 1 is always an essay question. It can be any poem. You have done 11 poems in grade 11 2024. It means that any poem is going to be based on either context or essay, and therefore it means that you must be prepared for anything. Any poem can come in as an essay, any poem can come in as a context, and I believe the drill has been, you've been doing both essay and context for every poem that you have done. Remember, we have a structure for an essay question that we must instill in ourselves for us to prepare the way for the paper 2. It says, with close reference to diction, imagery, and tone, those are the 3 things that are dominating our question today that we focus on. Remember, the structure of the essay question must be that you have an introduction, and then you must split your content according to what is in the question. It means that you will have diction, imagery, and tone. And it says, critically discuss the validity of this statement. Your response should take the form of a well-constructed essay of 200 to 250 words. Now, when we're coming in, what are we taking? Any diction that we're taking, it must be connected to this statement. Younger brothers, the poet's younger brother, that's the elegy, wherein the speaker must cope with grief of others in addition to processing his own sad loss. So any diction that we're going to take must be connecting us to the coping with grief of others and processing his own sad loss. So when we're coming into the essay question, we must be able to identify the words. Diction are words. We must be clear. When talking of diction, we are talking of words that we must quote and then we must comment on. So we must put the diction word here, and then we must comment. So as a result, we always encourage our learners that you discuss about 3 to 4 words. That will be enough. You take your 3 to 4 imagery figures of speech and then 2 tones, and then it means that you will sail through for the essay. So now when we're coming into the diction, we must be able to identify the words that we can use. And I believe one of the things that we must talk about, it says, in the porch, I made my father crying. So now I believe the first words that we are going to use are these ones. We are going to talk about the father crying in line 4. So we are going to take this one. And I believe when we're coming into father crying, we have to be very clear that we are commenting on only father crying. And now when we're coming and saying commenting, I believe it is the devastation in the father in coping with the loss of the child. And I believe he fails to understand, or he is shocked by the grief of the father and how he fails to contain his emotions and grief towards the loss. So we can also talk about what is this one? I believe we can also talk about I was embarrassed. I believe when we're talking about the word embarrassed, we are going to be talking about the issue of the unusual reverse behavior that he encounters when he gets there. The behavior is in reverse, as we are saying adults are giving him the respect. So when we're coming into embarrassed, he fails to cope with the behavior of the adults during this time of the old men, in them showing their respect towards his loss. And then I believe one of the things we're going to talk about is cops. With the cops, I believe we have discussed this as we're talking about the poem, when we said this is the word that shows us his detachment and shock towards the death of the younger brother. And this is now focusing on him. I believe our question in 2 sections. It said cope with the grief of others. And I believe the father came in the section of speaking of the coping with the grief of others, the embarrassment towards the elders. And I believe we could have also talked about the mother's angry, tearless sighs. That could have been the third one. Angry, tearless sighs, I believe, is what we can take there. And I believe we're talking about the mother's loss as we realize the anger towards the loss and her failure now to express herself in losing a child. So 3 diction words could have come out. Any of them were relevant when it comes to the coping with the grief of others. But now when coming to his processing his own said loss, this is now directed to him, because this is his terminology talking about the body of the deceased brother. I believe when I say detachment, we understand that he now mentions the brother's body as a corpse, which shows that he still is in disbelief and failure to cope with his own loss. And I believe we're also going to talk about the issue of whispers. We could have also taken whispers could have come in, which made him very uncomfortable. I believe when it comes to the old people, the whispers is also relevant, because they are not talking loudly, but they are talking in hushed tones and he can hear them. And therefore it means that makes him very uncomfortable and embarrassed, because the discussion is based on him. And I believe we can also talk about Godi. I believe here we're talking about it says no Godi scars. And I believe that shows his disbelief that the child is not, the brother is not disfigured, but the child was knocked clear and died instantly, and therefore he was not disfigured by the car that hit him. And I believe 4-foot box, reference to 4-foot box, is also something also that we can talk about to say it is the comparison of the age of the child to uh, the size of the coffin that he is placed in. So those are the things that we are talking about when it comes to diction. You take a word, and then what do? You are going to comment on the word, and those are the things that we are talking about when it comes to diction. 4 words are enough. 3 to 4 words are enough. I think I talked about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 words as a way of us trying to internalize the poem. When it comes to imagery of the poem, now we are going to talk about images and figures of speech. They are the ones that we must be focusing on at this moment in time. I believe we are going to talk about when it comes to figures of speech, literary devices. Okay, I'm going to write them on the side here. I believe one of the things I'm going to talk about is the onomatopoeia. That's the first one I will discuss. The onomatopoeia of could by the baby. So when we are talking about could of the baby, one of the things is it shows the innocence of the child amongst the crying family. So that's to show that the baby is unaware. I believe we're talking about the baby being unaware, is unaware of the death as the baby is young. So that's one word that we can talk about. The other imagery that's coming into mind is euphemism. I believe we're going to talk about the euphemism of sorry for my trouble in line 10. For my trouble. So that's something else that we are also going to touch on, which shows the respect that the neighbors show, the outets show to him of the death of the brother. And I believe we're also going to talk about the alliteration. We are also going to touch on the alliteration, and I believe the alliteration that we can touch on is the F sound in a 4-foot box, a foot for every year. That shows the innocence and the age of the child, the painful age of a 4-year-old dying so young and their life cut short. So I believe the other thing we can talk about is the issue of the metaphor, whereby it's wearing a poppy bruise, whereby my apologies, whereby we are talking about the comparison of the red of a poppy to that of a bloody bruise. So that's another one. There were so many. You just needed 4 and you'll be safe. I believe the metaphor is in line. Where is this one? Wearing a poppy bruise on his left temple. That is line 19. So as a result, that's another figure of speech that is coming in. The simile also could have been used of the 4-foot box being compared to a cot, which is line 20, whereby they compare the coffin to a cot, which is linking the brother's coffin to his bed, where he usually sleeps as a baby. So there were so many figures of speech that you could have taken. Any of them were relevant. I believe we've mentioned so many. Any 4 were relevant. Let's go to the tone of the poem. I believe the tone of the poem, the things we're going to talk about when it comes to the tone of the poem, I believe we're talking of somberness. We have a somber tone. And I believe when we're talking about the somber tone, which brings the stark reality of the child's death. And I believe we also have a reflective tone, When we say reflective tone, I believe it is brought by the nostalgia and the loss that he experienced when he was young. So any of those were relevant. A nostalgic tone is also coming in, as he was still a child by then. So any of those were relevant. Any two tones discussed brings you to a paragraph of tone. So that is what we call an essay question. And when we're coming to the essay question, we're talking about the issue that we must be sure that we touch on all the elements of the three requirements. It can be diction, it can be image, and it can be tone, it can be the mood, it can be the theme. Any of those is appropriate. So as long as you touch on them, linking to the statement that is given to the question, it means that you have your 10 marks for the essay. All right, let's go to our next poem. Our next poem in this paper that we are using as a guideline is Sonnet 130. This is a poem that is done 2 years consecutively, because you do it in grade 11 and it will be your first poem in grade 12 as well. So as a result, it will be a bonus for you to analyze and understand this poem, because you will do it in the grade 12 syllabus again. My Mistress's Eyes Are Nothing Like the Sun is a Shakespeare and sonnet, 14 lines, as we know. And as a result, we're talking about the quatrains, and we're talking about it having what do we call it? Two sections. If you're saying it has two sections, we are clear that we're talking about the first 12 lines, whereby we are talking about in the last two lines, which is the rhyming couplet. So now when we're coming in, we are making sure that we understand that we talk about the structure of the poem, and then we talk about the structure linking it to the content of the poem. And now we must be able to understand that we have two sections there. So now when we're coming in, we have a sonnet that has 14 lines, and I believe we have an octave. So we're talking about an octave that is line 1 to 12. Line 1 to 12, and I believe the octave is divided into quatrains. So when we're talking about quatrains, we're talking about line 1 to 4, line 5 to, and so forth and so forth. So it means that you divide it into what is this one? 3 quatrains. Line 1 to 4 is quatrain number 1. Line 5 to 8 is quatrain number 2. Line 9 to what is this one? Line, yes, 9 to 12 is the third quatrain, and therefore that becomes our octave. But now when we come to line 13 to 14, we call it a rhyming couplet, because it only consists of 2 lines. So the couplet sums up the poet's final thoughts, and therefore that's the division of the sonnet. So the most important thing we must understand is that Sonnet 130 deviates from the usual sonnets that were written during the Shakespearean times. Sonnets were meant to complement the beauty of the female, and therefore when we say the sonnet complements the beauty of the female, it means that the sonnet is supposed to be the typical sonnets are loaded with beautiful metaphors, similes, and comparisons, and therefore it means that they are comparing them to immortal things, and they are comparing them to beautiful things. But now in this instance, they are supposed to be compared and complemented. So the compliments are the ones that give the flattery to the female. That's what we call the typical love poems and sonnets. But we find a deviation in Sonnet 130, because we do not have the usual compliments and flattery. Instead, we're having bluntness, because Shakespeare is giving the sonnet as a mockery. When we say he's giving the sonnet as a mockery, we must be very clear that the mockery is not towards the mistress, but the mockery is towards his fellow sonnet writers. So as a result, it means that he was mocking the other poems that were written by his colleagues. And therefore, it means that he was saying you are lying to the mistresses, and therefore it means that you are not being honest to them. So what does it do? The mockery, as I will repeat, is not based towards the mistress. The mockery is based towards his fellow sonnet writers and composers who wrote those typical love poems. So when we're coming to Sonnet 130, we have negative similes and metaphors, because he does not say my mistress's eyes are like the sun. He says my mistress's eyes are nothing like the sun. So when he gives the opposite of the simile, we call it a negative simile, a negative metaphor, and that's what dominates the poem. The poem is dominated by bluntness because he does not compliment the mistress. Instead, what it does is to give honest observations of the mistress. It even borders on insults when it comes to this poem, because the way he is so blunt, it now also borders on insults. And now when we're coming into this poem, we must understand that he does not use any complimentary terms. He uses opposite. It is talking to the mistress in blunt opposite comments of her beauty, and therefore it means that he does not flatter the mistress. Comparisons are done. The mistress's eyes are nothing like the sun, he says, which means that they are not bright, they are dull. Coral is far more red than the lips is red. The lips that are meant to be red and shiny, instead he calls them pale. He even compares them to coral, which is a pale pink color. If snow be white, why then a breast are done? When it comes into talking about the breast being done, we are talking about the Shakespeare mentioning a gray-brown color, which means that it is not pleasing to the eye. And I believe when we're coming in, we are talking about when he says if snow be white, I believe that is what we call a cliche. Snow being snow white is a cliche that white is equivalent to beauty. And it says if hairs be wires, black wires grow on a head. And instead of the mistress being compared to as a blonde, no, he compares the hair to black wires, which means the hair is very coarse, opposite of soft, and therefore it means that it is not beautiful. So as a result, we are looking at the comparisons that he does, the negative comparisons that he does, and the unflattering compliments that he gives, which are bordering on insults. I have seen roses damask red and white, but no such roses see I in her cheeks. And he says, when he brings in, he says a woman's beauty is usually compared to roses, but he does not see that beauty in her cheeks because the cheeks are pale. And in some perfumes is there more delight than in the breath that from my mistress reeks. Now he goes to the mistress's breath, and he says the word does not really mean stinks, but I believe it's an unpleasant smell. So as a result, we are talking about the issue that the breath is not like perfume. Instead, it does not have a pleasant smell. I love to hear her speak, yet well I know that music hath far more a pleasing sound. He is not saying that her voice is terrible, but just that music sounds more sweeter than her voice. So now when we're coming in, he's saying, I grant I never saw a goddess go. I admit, that's what he says. Grant is admit. I admit she does not have the perfection, and therefore I've never seen a goddess go. He says goddesses did not walk, they floated on air. But he says my mistress, when she walks, treads on the ground. She is human, she is grounded, she does not float like the goddesses. So as a result, she is a real character. A goddess is an unreal character. But he still says when she walks, she treads on the ground, heavily walks on the ground. That's what he says. So now he is realistic about her. So now when we come into those lines that we've talked about, line 1 to 12, we are getting the image of no flattery at all, an image of bluntness. She is not this, she is not pleasing. That's what he's saying. And now when we come in, we get the impression that there is nothing beautiful about the mistress. And as such, comes to physical beauty. So when he is making a declaration in line 1 to 12 is that there is no way I can compare her to all these flattering things. And I believe he gives us the reason in line 13 to 14, where he says, and yet by heaven, I think my love as rare as any she bellied with false compare. The function of the rhyming couplet cancels out the problem that has been given and brings the solution. The problem is outlined in line 1 to 12, whereby the mistress is not physically appealing, but it cancels out her physically unappealing state when it gets to line 13 to 14, when he says, I do not love her for her physical state. I love her for who she is. And I believe he brings the real love in line 13 to 14 and says, I do not need to compare her to any false comparisons that are done by typical love poets. Instead, I love my mistress for who she is, which means we have a special kind of love. And therefore, it means that he loves the mistress for her worth and who she is and for not what she looks like. So now when we're coming in, we are talking about how we look at the playfulness. When we come to the mood, we're talking about the teasing, humorous, playful mood that is brought out in line 1 to 12. But now we are talking about the adoration of and the tone of adoration in the loving tone in line 13 to 14, which switches. Now, when we come to line 1 to 12, there is a different mood and tone, which, as we said, is very teasing, is very playful, is very humorous, is very blunt. But when we come to line 13 to 14, we're talking about adoration, pure love, and now, or loving, and now we realize the Shakespeare loves his mistress despite her physical appearance. So now when we coming to this type of poem, we must be able to understand that the poem is satiric. When we say the poem is satiric, we are saying that Shakespeare mocks the flatteries that are given by the typical love poems, and as a result, in how the typical love poems were written, unreal descriptions. He mocks the unreal descriptions of the subject of the loved ones of the typical love poems, and therefore the cliches. I believe he mocks the cliches as well of the typical love poems. So now when we're coming in, as I said, we always have a problem with Lena saying he mocks the mistress. He is mocking the flattery, the cliches, the unrealistic descriptions, the lies, and all these things that are shown as true love by the typical love poems, and their love is dependent on physical looks. So instead, with him, his love is not based on looks, but it is based on the true love. Let's look at the summary of the quatrains. I believe the first quatrains is talking about the lips, the skin color, and the hair. And then when we coming to the second quatrain, he describes the complexion and the breath. And the third quatrain, he describes the voice and a walk. So as a result, that is how you can internalize the poem to say, when I'm focusing on this quatrain, I must be touching on these ones. Okay, let's go to a sample of contextual questions that we are going to use to internalize the poem. Refer to lines, my mistress's eyes are nothing like the sun. That's line 1. Identify and explain the figure of speech used in these lines. I believe when we're coming to the figure of speech, we are definitely calling it a negative simile, as we have said. It is not a normal simile, but because it is the opposite, we call it a negative simile. It was a 3-mark question, which means we are supposed to be clear, whereby the mistress's eyes are compared to the sun. That's your 2nd mark. And I believe the 3rd mark is that the sun is bright and beautiful. However, However, his mistress's eyes are not as bright and beautiful as the sun. Remember, number one, you mention the figure of speech. Number two, you mention what is compared or what is done in the figure of speech. Number three, you give its effectiveness and its meaning. So those are the 3 marks, as we say, negative simile. 2.2 says, in line 12, my mistress treads on the ground. It says, my mistress, when she walks, treads on the ground. And it says, explain what the speaker suggests about the manner in which his mistress walks as compared to the goddess in line 11. One thing that he has said is, I believe we're talking about the mistress does not float or have a light walk. Instead, the mistress heavily steps on the ground. And I believe I touched on it when we're discussing the poem, when we are saying that she does not have an unrealistic walk whereby she floats. Instead, what are we saying? She walks heavily on the ground or as a heavy walk, and therefore we must be clear on that one. So when we are answering such questions, we must be very clear. And I believe when we are talking to this one, we should be saying, her feet touches the ground. She heavily steps on the ground. She does not walk gracefully. Those are the answers we are talking about. So as a result, she does not glide when walking. Instead, she heavily steps on the ground. Comment on how the rhyming, or discuss the importance of the words and yet, line 13, in the context of the poem as a whole. One of the things we must be clear about is that we understand the name of this change in the content and the tone. The name is a volta. When we say and yet, we call it as it's a volta in the poem because it signals a change in tone, it signals a change in content. So now we are saying it shows us now a switch in Shakespeare deviating and changing from focusing on the physical features of the mistress, and now is going to talk about the true reality of their love. So as a result, it gives a shift, and it's called a volta. Change in mood, change in tone, change in content. Comment on how the rhyming couplet expresses the speaker's true feelings towards his mistress. And I believe we've talked about this to say the true love, rare love, not based on physical beauty, but based on feelings. So as a result, cancels out the negativity that surrounds and the bluntness that surrounds the features of the mistress, but now focuses on the feelings. So as a result, what is he saying? He loves his mistress, and therefore he will be doing an injustice by using hollow and meaningless phrases and comparisons. So as a result, his feelings are real and their love is true and rare. That's the poem you'll be doing the first month of opening in grade 12. Okay, let's go to, we are going to go to a sample of our novel section. Our novel section is Tsotsi, and when we're coming to Tsotsi, we are talking about an essay question and a context question. So we are going to do both as a way of internalizing our novel. Tsotsi is a novel that is based on the apartheid era and the poverty and dire circumstances that faced the Black person in South Africa. Now, when we're coming in, we are saying Tsotsi is a character that goes through evolution and a change. He grows as a character, and as a result, when he grows as a character, we get to realize that he becomes a full transformation of a human being. And I believe we are talking about when we say a transformation, I believe we're talking of his change from a gangster to becoming uh, um, finding his identity, redeeming himself, and growing. But now he does not go through that journey alone. I believe we have characters like Boston. We have characters like the baby. We have characters like Maurice Chabalala. We have characters like Miriam. We have characters like Isaiah, uh, the pastor or the priest that help him through his transformation. And therefore, that's what we are focusing on in this poem. So now when we're coming into Tsotsi, the novel, we are talking about the setting. When we talk about the setting is going to contribute towards their identity. So as a result, we are looking at what they became due to the circumstances of the times and the setting and what it made them become. What it made them become now shows their history. So as a result, we now look at the identity crisis that is amongst Tsotsi, whereby now that leads him now to become a David Masonda again, and now he goes back to becoming a human being because I believe he is painted as a monster when we begin, heartless, cruel, a murderer, but now transforms now to a savior, someone who dies and sacrifices himself in saving the baby. So now when we're coming into identity, we're coming into redemption, we're coming into discovery, self-discovery. Those are the things that we're talking about. I'm going to touch on his character before we even get to the question, because I believe his character as a protagonist is the one that really brings us to understanding the novel. He is a leader of a gang. He is brutal. He is ruthless. He is indifferent. And I believe he represents the worst of human nature as he is driven by poverty, anger towards his circumstances and his childhood that he blocks out as a young person. And I believe he's very cold. He's a merciless killer because the only intention he has is to kill his victims. So now when we're coming in, we realize that his childhood has a big impact in what he has become. I believe when we're talking about his childhood, we're talking about separation from his mother during the police raid and the horror of watching his dog uh, give birth to stillborn puppies before dying, the horror of witnessing the brutality of the attack by his father on his dog after the father kicks it, which forces him now to suppress his memories. And what does it ultimately lead to? It leads to him changing his identity. Changing his name to Tsotsi does not only suppress his memories, but it also changes his morality and he loses his conscience as David. He becomes the leader of a gang and assumes a new identity and name, which is Tsotsi, whereby he commits terrible crimes. So now when we come in, we realize the darkness that surrounds him and we realize the circumstances that lead him to be that way. And now when we talk about taking responsibility, he does not, because what does he do? He actually uses his background and his anger towards his background to shape himself. Now, when we're coming in, we realize the baby plays a role in his life. He evolves from being as unscrupulous, a relentless killer. He becomes a caring young man because from hard he becomes soft, uncaring he becomes caring. And I believe the baby now also forces his memories to resurface, and therefore I believe that changes him back to becoming David. Maurice Chabalala, who he stalks as a victim originally, evokes what is unfamiliar to him. he becomes sympathetic to Maurice because Maurice awakens the memory of his dog in a vulnerable situation that it was in when his father kicked it. And therefore, the interaction that he has with Maurice Chabalala makes Tsotsi realize that he must value the little things in life in order to redeem himself. And he actually lets Maurice live. So he becomes caring and compassionate when he cares for Boston. He is able to go deep within himself, share his feelings and experiences with Boston, and he has the courage to follow through the quest to find God and salvation after he questions and has conversations with Boston about life and God. In being vulnerable, he opens up to Isaiah, and he learns that to gain an understanding of God, he must attend church. He feels lighter when he commits to do whatever it takes to pursue the goal of redemption on his own. And he also accepts Miriam's kind gestures, and he no longer relies on threatening people to help him, assist him, or do something for him. And I believe the relationship evolves also, and Miriam now willingly feeds the crying baby and cares for the baby. He trusts Miriam, but he's still hesitant to leave the baby with her. But the trust enables him to open up and also to listen to her when he is being advised. She's very positive about her future, and it makes it possible for him to realize he can leave his past lifestyle behind. And therefore, I believe he changes from a violent man and he now becomes more human. That's why now it becomes easy for him to sacrifice himself to save the baby. So when he sacrifices himself and his own safety for the baby, that is his full redemption, and he becomes David again. So when we're coming in talking about redemption, as the question is going to start, we had to find the evolution and take it to what it becomes and what it was at the beginning. The question is based on a quotation, and this is something that we must accustom ourselves to. As in grade 12, we have a lot of essay questions based on quotations. The quotation is from Joss Whedon, which says, redemption is something you have to fight for in a very personal, down dirty way. Some of our characters lose that, some stray from that, and some regain it. In a carefully planned essay of 350 to 400 words in length, discuss the extent to which you believe that the novel Tsotsi is ultimately a story of redemption. Right. When coming into redemption, the things we're going to talk about when it comes to redemption are based on some of the things we've already talked about as we were discussing the novel. One of the things we should talk about is that change and rebirth happens. So when we are talking about change and rebirth, we are mentioning the issue of change from to something. So when we're coming about to Tsotsi, we are taking a change from a life taker, and he moves to being a life saver. So we are showing his full circle of redemption when we take him from discussing him as a life taker, when he ruthlessly kills Gamput Dlamini in at the train station in chapter 1. And I believe we are going to take him to being a lifesaver when he sacrifices his safety for the baby in chapter 12. So this is us coming in when we are saying personal, down dirty way, when we take him from the gangster, feared person that he was, and then we take him to what he has become. Tsotsi facing his past, and I believe triggered by the baby, is something that we must talk about. Very uncaring, very cruel, and has suppressed his own childhood memories. But now, when he changes, and I believe we now talk about him accepting the baby, taking the baby in, and actually taking care of it. And I believe now we're talking about redemption. And now, when we're talking about going to Isaiah, we are talking about trying to lighten the load of guilt in him and the life that he has been caring for so long. He goes to the church and gives Isaiah the commitment that he will attend church regularly. When he learns more about God and Christianity, he moves away from his sin, which leads to him feeling lighter and actually accepting becoming a new person. So when we talk about the things that are catalysts in his life that change him to taking responsibility of the child, taking responsibility of Boston after he beats him up, I believe that is him redeeming himself. When he beats Boston for asking questions, I believe we realize that he did not tolerate the breaking of the code. Personal questions must not be asked. Beats him to a pulp, I believe. And now eventually he goes back to take care of the person that he beat to a pulp. And through caring for Boston, he gets closer to him. When he gets closer to Boston, that's when he realizes the connection of the spirit to Christianity. And therefore, that's where he finally takes the other walk of Christianity. So nurturing Boston, discussing life issues with Boston allows Tsotsi to redeem himself, not only to Boston, but also to himself. So when we're talking about the essay question, we need to have the pill being implemented. I believe when we talk about the pill, we must be able to say learners must be able to give points, must be able to explain them, give evidence, and link them in the novel. And therefore, as such, our key to this essay was the redemption part. And as such, that's why we had to bring in characters that are catalysts to his redemption. So as such, when we're coming in and you are practicing in preparation for writing the essay question, please make sure that you are able to use the pill method for you to discuss it properly. The pill method, what does it do? It drives you away from narrating or summarizing the poem and generalizing. You need to stick to giving points that will help you answer the question. And in answering the question, it will help you to actually align yourself to answering correctly. So those are the things that we can refer to when talking about the essay question. As I said, we are discussing Tsotsi and how he finds his way to coming back to becoming David again and moving away from being Tsotsi and finding his way again. All right, let's go to simpler context. These are just discussion points of us aligning ourselves to the question. Right. When we are coming in, remember you have two extracts for the contextual, and therefore it means that your contexts are based on what you have been given. Let's go to the first extract of our contextual questions. Right. Our first extract was coming from chapter 1. Right. It says, and now in the train, still alive, jammed in with as many as the coach could hold, going home in a smell of hard work and tobacco smoke, his ears as full as his nose with the low murmur of tired voices, himself impatient because the writing man was coming to his room at 6:30 and there was still a half-hour walk from the station. And in between all this thinking of Makulu, then his tie, and seeing it crumpled by the rush to get in, wanting to straighten it but finding with slow surprise that he could not move either arm. He never had time to register the full meaning of that moment. He tried a second time, but the up was so strong. Tsotsi smiled at the growing bewilderment on the big bastard's face, waiting for and catching the explosion of darkness in the eyes as Butcher worked the spoke up and into his heart. Even as that was happening, Tsotsi bent close to the dying man and in his ear whispered an obscene reference to his mother. A moment of hate at the last he had learnt disfigured the face in death. D-Up still had his arms locked around the man's waist. As the body slumped, the other three crowded in and with the combined pressure of their bodies held it erect, a move unnoticed in the crowded coach. Boston was nearest and who was also sick right through his brain, threw his heart into his stomach and was fighting to keep it down. Boston, it was who slipped his hand into the pocket and took out the pay packet. This is from the Meta of Gamput Dlamini. When you are doing contextual questions, please put a scenario in your head to say, where is this coming from? What was happening? And I believe that's where you give yourself a mental picture of the Meta of Gamput Dlamini at the train station in chapter 1. And then that will guide you now to be in line with answering correctly. How does the description of the train, line 1, illustrate the way of life for people in the context of the novel? When we are, let's go to line 1 again, and I believe it said, and now in the train, jammed in with as many as the coach could hold, going home in a smell of hard work and tobacco smoke. Right. Now it says the description of the train. How does it illustrate the way of life for people in the context of the novel? Poverty is coming in. Poverty, a life of poverty, and I believe of life of poverty during the apartheid system. It shows the harsh, relentless pace of life during the apartheid system of a Black person in the poor locations of the locations. So now when we're coming in, we're talking about crowded. They used one mode of transport for them, which was the train. And I believe we realize poverty and the way of life, the harsh way of life and the harsh pace of life during the apartheid system. We go to refer to paragraph 1, which is 7.2. 7.2 says, what is the name of the man alluded to with the pronoun his? And I believe this is Gamput Dlamini. This is Gamput Dlamini. Mention 2 reasons which caused him to be targeted. The red tie, if we remember clearly from chapter 1, it was the red tie, the smile on his face, and I believe it was paying for his train ticket with his pay pocket. So those are the things, pay packet, those are the things, envelope. I believe the envelope was the giveaway that made him to be targeted. Account for Tsotsi having whispered an obscene reference to his mother in line 13. When we're coming to this one, I believe it was an emphasis on the expression of hate on the face of the dying man. And therefore, what does it do? Which means that he curses the man to his hatred during the murder or in the last moments of his life. And I believe as we are talking about this, when we say expression of hate, it is to seal in his hatred and violence in the eyes of in the life of the man that he kills during that time. The character of the next question said, the character of Boston is different to the rest of the gang. Explain clearly why Boston is sick right through his brain. Boston has a conscience. That's one of the things that made him stand out in the gang. He had a conscience, and one of the things that he had feelings. And therefore, it means that sympathy, pain would arise in him. And that's why he was against the unnecessary deaths and murders that would happen. So as a result, he's different from the rest of the gang because he would feel regret. And therefore, I believe that is why he would vomit and get sick after the robberies and the deaths that would occur during the robberies. So as a result, he had a conscience, which the rest of the crew did not. Let's go to extract B. He woke up late the next morning. He had slept long. The sun had cleared the rooftops and it was already hot. It was a new day, and what he had thought out last night was still there inside him. Only one thing was important to him now. Come back, the woman had said. Come back, Tsotsi. I must correct her, he thought. My name is David Madondo.
He said it out loud in the almost empty street and laughed. The man delivering milk heard him and looking up said, "Peace, my brother. Peace be with you." David Matondo replied and carried on his way. He heard the bulldozers and saw the dust a long way away. It was a strange noise, and he had been hearing it for a long time. When he turned the corner and saw them, he stopped and stared. The slum clearance had entered a second and decisive stage. The white township had grown impatient. The ruins, they said, were being built up again, and as many were still coming in as they carried off in lorries to the new locations or in vans to the jails. So they had sent in the bulldozers to raise the buildings completely to the ground. He started running from the bottom of the street and halfway up started shouting, "No, stop, stop." People stopped and watched him pass, and because of the look in his eyes, turned and followed him. A few cried, "Stop," with him, but not knowing why. He jumped through the ruins, leaving the others behind because they weren't going in there. And because of the noise and the dust, those who were inside waiting with sledgehammers behind the bulldozer, they did not hear or see him. They were watching the wall, and it was with something like sadness because they all remembered Marabatsi. This is from chapter 12, which is the last chapter of the novel. It says, discuss why the beginning of the extract can be said to be ironic. The beginning of the extract had a description of the day. I believe he talked about the sun had cleared. It was already hot. It was a new day. And what he had thought out last night was still there inside him. So as a result, when we're coming into the sun, the day begins as beautiful, but unfortunately it ends tragically, because the beginning of the extract shows the happiness in him, and I believe the light-heartedness atmosphere that is created. But unfortunately, it ends in tragedy because he loses his life the same day. Refer to the description of the morning in lines 1 to 3, when it says, as we said, the sun had cleared. He slept long that morning, it says. And I believe the description of the morning is the clearing of the sun, the hotness, and I believe it was a new day. Unfortunately, the new day brought his death. And I believe what is the mood established? A light-hearted mood. And I believe we're talking about a beautiful day being described. And I believe when you say mood, a light-hearted mood is portrayed. Discuss why the symbolism of the morning is particularly relevant to David. The new day is a new life for him, as he starts off that day not as Tsotsi but as David Matondo, which is his true identity. So the symbolism of the morning is him now reverting back to his original identity of his real name, and I believe it was a new start to his life as his character of David, not as Tsotsi. So the morning brought the end to Tsotsi and a new beginning to him as David. Referred to, I must correct her, he thought, who is the her alluded to? In chapter 12 with Miriam, I believe that's the person that they refer her to. Explain the role she plays. She is also a catalyst to his change, and I believe not only does she do that, I believe we're also talking about caregiver to the baby, feeds the baby, and as a result, we are talking about caretaker of the child. But she is also a catalyst to Tsotsi's change in life. Refer to extract A and B. Using these extracts to guide your answer, critically discuss how the theme of redemption relates to the character of Tsotsi. Chapter 1, we get the ruthless villain protagonist that we're talking about. Tsotsi is ruthless. Tsotsi is a murderer. And now we're talking about a life taker in chapter 1, and we talk about feared and the such. But when we come to chapter 12, we see how he has redeemed himself, and now he saves the baby, sacrifices his own life to save the baby at the end. And I believe we now see a full transformation in Tsotsi, whereby he does not hesitate to run to the shambles of the building to save the baby. So that's the full redemption. This is us just giving a discussion of what you focus on when talking and revising, talking about our paper 2, grade 11 literature section. A good day to you.